Hey, what's going on, everybody? So over the weekend, I had a conversation with two people. We're going to call the mother Stephanie, and we're going to call the boyfriend Scott. So I had a conversation with Stephanie and Scott, and Stephanie actually had her children taken by the government, right? So the two children are Todd, who's a son, and then Kaylin, who's a daughter. Now, I've never been in a situation like this, and I've never known anyone to actually been in this situation. So I've actually heard stories, from a third party, from people I didn't know, where they'll say, well, such and such had her children taken by the government, so on and so forth. But I've never really heard a story like this firsthand, right? From someone who is actually going through something like this. So I thought with my channel, this would be a really good opportunity to explore the world of child protective services and explore the world of what it's like to have your children taken by the government, and also what your possible legal options are at that point. Now, this all began by Scott. He reached out to me. Scott reaches out to me, and he wanted to pursue having a claim against the government in federal court. He was asking about an action for a 1983 claim, which is basically called a deprivation of rights under color law. And, we're going to get into that. But before we actually get into that, we actually have to get some of the story so that we have some sort of context, right? So as I can actually remember the story, and I can't remember all the details, I initially recorded the story, but for whatever reason, the recording didn't come out that well. So I'm going to have to try to narrate this story as best I can using my memory. So it all starts off with Stephanie being in a situation where she has this huge apartment and she wants to make some extra money. So she decides to rent out one of the bedrooms. And what ends up happening is that this couple, who is an LGBTQ couple, comes along, and they decided that they want to rent this bedroom from Stephanie. So we're going to call one of the ladies Tasha, and we're going to call the other one Erica for the purposes of this video. So Tasha and Erica, they go to Stephanie, and of course they want to rent this room out. And my personal opinion is that whenever you meet someone for the first time, you're not actually meeting that person, you're meeting their representatives. And I say that because everyone puts on their best face when they're pursuing an opportunity, but over time it's hard to maintain this aura of goodness, and eventually your true self comes out, right? So that's why I say you're meeting a person's representative. You're not actually meeting that person when you meet them for the first time, right? So for whatever reason, I guess everything went pretty well, and Stephanie decides to rent out the room to Tasha and Erica. And from what I can understand, I didn't get a sense of how long everything was good, but from what I can understand, everything was smooth. The money was coming in, the relationship was great, but somewhere along the lines, I guess, that representative stepped out of the picture, and then the actual people stepped in, who is Tasha and Erica. And what ends up happening is that Stephanie and Tasha, they get into some type of physical altercation. And from that point on, it was basically total war, right? So you have this situation where you have several people living under one roof, and they're not getting along. And it seems like Tasha was extremely manipulative. So Tasha was constantly trying to do things to ruin the relationship between Stephanie, the mother, and her son Todd. And from the way I'm hearing the story, is that anytime Stephanie would try to discipline her son, or whenever Stephanie would tell her son he couldn't have something, Tasha would come along and she would manipulate the son and basically, say, your mother doesn't like you, and, she's evil, so on and so forth. So this was a situation where Tasha was constantly in Stephanie's son's ear, and she was sowing seeds of hate. Anytime there was a disagreement between Stephanie and her son Todd, Tasha would wait until Stephanie wasn't around, and then she would spill seeds of hate into the mind of her son Todd. So this went on for some time, and I think, as I can remember the story, what ends up happening is that sometime around October, I think Todd somehow gets up into Stephanie's art supplies. And in the art supplies, there's like a cutting saw or something of that nature. So Tasha takes a picture of Todd with the cutting saw, and she sends it off to Child Protective Services. And she basically says that, Stephanie has created this unsafe environment for the son. At least this is as far as I can remember. So what happens is that Child Protective Services assigns a caseworker who we're going to call Tara. Tara comes out to the house. She listens to the story. Stephanie explains that, this is her art. This is a saw from her art supplies. It was in an armoire, and it was placed out of the children's reach. And she doesn't even know how he got a hold of that, so on and so forth. And then I guess the caseworker also spoke to Tasha, who is the hateful, conniving roommate at this point, right? And for whatever reason, I think Tara basically created a case, but for whatever reason, she didn't really take any action, right? So she doesn't take any action. She leaves the children in place, and basically she leaves at this point. So everything seems to be working at this point. I mean, there's still, well, I guess at this point, Stephanie doesn't understand that Tasha is actually trying to get her kids taken away from her. And she doesn't really catch on that, Tasha is really trying to destroy her. So what ends up happening is that around November, December, Stephanie is actually trying to discipline her child. And I think somehow or another, what ends up happening is that, her son, he crawls under the bed and he ends up scratching himself. And shortly after that, what ends up happening is Stephanie ends up trying to discipline her son, and Tasha goes and calls Child Protective Services yet again. But at this point, Tasha had put a lot of work into creating a rift between Stephanie and her son Todd. For example, Tasha had told Stephanie's son Todd that, hey, your mom can't do this. She can't, try to discipline you. She can't spank you. Things of that nature. And, Todd would act out and he would say, you can't hit me. You're not allowed to hit me. And I think at this point, she probably even showed Todd how to call Child Protective Services. So you have this situation where Stephanie is basically having her parental rights usurped from her. And Tasha is kind of like, the serpent that's in this Garden of Eden, if you will, that's trying to create this rift between Stephanie and her son Todd and her daughter Kayla. So, fast forward November, December, what ends up happening, Todd crawls under the bed. He gets a scratch on his back. And then shortly after that, what happens is that Stephanie, she actually tries to discipline Todd, and, there's this, huge fight. So someone calls Child Protective Services. Tara comes out again, the caseworker. She comes out again, and then she basically ends up taking the kids away. What happens from there is that they have a phone conversation, and in that phone conversation between Stephanie and the caseworker Tara, she ends up telling Stephanie that I'm going to make sure you never see your kids again, right? So, I mean, this story is just kind of really crazy and bizarre. I mean, at this point, I don't really know what to think about this story. You guys let me know what you think about this story thus far. But, the thing of it is that Tara, the caseworker, she's acting, it sounds like she's acting in the way that, no caseworker should be acting. She sounds really unprofessional. So I'm not really sure what's going on here. You guys let me know what you think, right? So Tara takes the kids, and then they have a court hearing. Basically, I think this thing is called a shelter hearing. And by the way, I forgot to add this. This is all in the state of Florida, right? So they have what's called a shelter hearing, and I've never really heard of this, but apparently it's a hearing where they try to determine whether or not the kids can come back home or if the kids need to go someplace else. That's what I can gather from, listening to Stephanie and also doing a little light research on the internet, right? So they have this shelter hearing, and it seems like the shelter hearing doesn't go well for Stephanie. And what ends up happening is that the kids are given to Stephanie's ex-boyfriends or ex-husband's grandparents, right? And or the ex-boyfriend parents. And, so the kids are with her ex's parents, and she's trying to get her kids back. And at this point, she's trying to figure out what she can do to get her kids back. Now, from what I understand, they actually ended up going to another court and they have another hearing. And this is where everything just gets really fuzzy. And again, I wish I had recorded everything so I can just put the recording there for you guys to hear. But what ends up happening is that they go to court again, and the government, Child Protective Services, it seems like they're offering to give the kids back if Stephanie agrees to go through a case plan. Now, from what I can understand, a case plan is whereby you go through a action plan with the government, and you take substance abuse classes, you take parenting classes, and you take you show them that you can keep an apartment, so on and so forth. So you have to kind of hop through these hoops to show that you're capable of having your kids and you're capable of raising your kids, right? So that's what they want her to go through, but she is refusing to go through all this, right? And then she also tells me because of Tasha and Erica, she's also lost her apartment. So if I'm remembering the details correctly, forgive me if I'm not remembering the details correctly, but it sounds like she's lost the apartment, and it sounds like she's being overwhelmed with the Child Protective Service court hearings, and now she's also trying to rectify her living situation. So it just sounds like, Stephanie at this point is in a jam, and she really doesn't have time to do all these things that the government wants her to do to get her kids back, right? So where the situation ends is actually she's assigned a lawyer. Apparently in these situations, the government in Florida, the state of Florida, will assign you a lawyer. So they get this lawyer, and the reports that I'm getting from Scott, her boyfriend, is that the lawyer doesn't seem like he's actually going to do anything. And it sounds like the lawyer is basically just there along for the ride, right? So he's a government appointed attorney. The allegation is that, he just wants to get the check. He's going to do as less as possible. That's the allegation that I'm getting. That's what I'm hearing. And so Scott, he goes on one of these legal forums, and he's asking for the process to actually file a claim in federal court under 1983 deprivation of civil rights, right? So we're going to talk about the deprivation of civil rights, but before we get into that, we're going to talk about a few other options at this point.